A millionaire unexpectedly chooses a weak and injured dog as a gift for his nephew. The boy promises to take care of it, but a few days later takes it to the cemetery, and then the fairground hummed with the energy of 100 conversations overlapping, the scent of caramel apples thick in the air. A balloon vendor struggled against the wind, his red and blue orbs bobbing wildly as a young girl squealed, tugging her mother's sleeve. Somewhere in the distance, a brass band struck up a tune, its notes weaving through the din of carnival rides and chatter. Richard Collins adjusted his coat and glanced down at his grandson. Tommy walked with the quiet precision of someone trying to take up less space. He wasn't sullen, but there was a carefulness to him, a restraint that didn't quite belong to a 9-year-old. Richard exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of time settle over his shoulders. "Where to first, kid?" he asked, forcing lightness into his tone. Tommy shrugged. "Just looking." They strolled past the brightly painted booths, past the farmers selling bushels of apples and fresh honey, past the game stalls where teenagers lined up to test their luck. It was a world Tommy should have been enamored with, yet he remained at a distance, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, observing but not engaging. Then he stopped. Richard followed his gaze and saw the auction pen, a makeshift enclosure set up at the far end of the fairground where livestock was being traded. Cattle shifted restlessly inside the fencing, but it wasn't the cows that had caught Tommy's attention. The dogs. A dozen of them, of different breeds and sizes, some barking and clawing at the wire, others panting nervously. The auctioneer, a stout man with a face red from either sun or whiskey, called out numbers with the sharp authority of someone accustomed to being ignored. Next up, a fine young border collie, sharp as they come. "Who'll start the bidding at 50? The collie wagged its tail hopefully. A woman raised her paddle. Richard was about to steer Tommy away when he noticed it. The one dog that didn't move. In the farthest corner of the pen, where the light barely touched, lay a Rottweiler. It was too still, too silent, its head resting on its paws, its coat dulled with dust and old wounds. It did not bark, it did not flinch, it simply stared past the fence, past the auctioneer, past everything. Tommy stepped closer. Richard recognized the look on his grandson's face before the boy even spoke. That quiet intensity, the way his fingers curled into fists as if holding on to something unseen. It was a look he had seen before, once, when Tommy had insisted on keeping an old army jacket that had belonged to his father, despite it being too large for him. "Grandpa," Tommy said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I want that one." Richard sighed, shifting his weight. "Tommy, that's not a pet. Look at him. He's in bad shape." "I don't care." The boy's hands tightened. "He's the one." The auctioneer squinted in their direction, clearly surprised by the interest in the motionless dog. "Ah, that one. Don't know much about him. No papers. Picked him up from the lot behind a rescue camp, according to the person who sold it to me. Likely got tossed out of some backyard. Ain't much good. Probably sick. Start at 50, but I'll be lucky to get that." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered something about damaged goods. Tommy's face didn't change, but Richard saw the way his jaw set. "Grandpa, please." Richard hesitated. He looked at the dog again, really looked this time. There was something unsettling in its stillness, a weight in its eyes that made Richard's stomach twist. The Rottweiler was young, but not entirely. Its body bore the marks of something more than just neglect. The bidding was non-existent. The auctioneer coughed into his hand, clearly ready to move on. Richard lifted his paddle. 75. The auctioneer blinked, startled. He looked around, but no one else showed interest. "Sold," he declared quickly, almost as if eager to rid himself of the animal. Tommy exhaled, shoulders dropping in relief. The transaction was swift. Richard signed a few papers, handed over the cash, and was given a leash that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The dog was led out of the pen, but he barely reacted. No excitement, no recognition of freedom. Tommy knelt in front of him, reaching out a hand. "Your name's Gus now," Tommy continued, his voice unwavering. "If that's okay with you." Gus didn't move. For a long moment, the boy and the dog simply stared at each other, not like an owner greeting his new pet, but like two strangers measuring something unspoken between them. Richard studied the scene, pressing his lips together. Maybe the auctioneer had been right. Maybe Gus really was broken beyond fixing. But then Tommy whispered something only the dog could hear. And for the first time, Gus blinked. Not much, just a flicker, a fraction of a second where recognition fought through whatever fog had settled over him. Richard wasn't sure what it meant. He wasn't even sure if it meant anything at all. But as he watched his grandson place a gentle hand on the Rottweiler's head, saw Gus finally exhale. Just the barest sigh, as if something deep within had released. He wondered if perhaps the choice hadn't been Tommy's at all. The estate sat under a sky that had long surrendered to the evening. Beyond the stone driveway, the vast stretch of trees whispered in the autumn wind, their dry leaves scraping against the ground like an unsettled hush. Inside, warm light filled the rooms, but there was a strange hollowness to it, a brightness that illuminated space rather than comforted it. Richard Collins had never thought of his house as lonely. It was large, certainly, but it had always been filled with people, staff, visitors, even friends on occasion. Yet, as he stood in the doorway of the mudroom, watching his grandson kneel beside a dog that refused to acknowledge him, he felt the quiet press in like something tangible. Tommy had been at it for an hour now. The boy had prepared everything himself. A thick woolen blanket had been laid inside a crate near the kitchen, along with a freshly poured bowl of water and a plate of cooked chicken, shredded carefully by small hands. He had even placed one of his own stuffed animals beside it, as if the gesture might make the space feel less foreign to Gus. And yet, the dog wouldn't move. Gus lay by the back door, his body stretched against the cold tile. His head rested on his paws, his ribs barely rising with each breath. He wasn't asleep, but he wasn't entirely present either. His gaze was distant, unfocused, as if he were waiting for something that had nothing to do with the boy watching him. Tommy shifted, resting his elbows on his knees. "You don't have to stay there, you know." His voice was quiet, patient, careful. "Your bed is over here. It's warmer." Gus did not react. Richard folded his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Tommy, come eat. You've been at this long enough." The boy didn't move. He reached forward instead, pushing the plate of chicken a little closer. "Maybe he doesn't like the crate," he said. "Maybe it reminds him of something bad." Richard exhaled, stepping into the room. "Then he can sleep anywhere he likes, so long as it's not blocking the door." His voice was gruff, but it lacked any real force. Tommy didn't argue, but he didn't give up either. He leaned back against the cabinet and opened a book, his fingers tracing the edges of the worn cover. "I'll just sit here," he said, more to himself than anyone else. Richard watched him for a moment, then turned away. He had seen this before, that quiet determination, that refusal to let go of something broken. It reminded him too much of Caleb. The next morning, the plate of chicken remained untouched. The water sat still and undisturbed. Gus was exactly where they had left him. Tommy frowned but said nothing. Instead, he tried again. This time, he didn't speak. He simply sat beside Gus, close but not too close, and read aloud. He chose a book about explorers, adventurers who had crossed mountains and oceans, braving the unknown with nothing but a map and a sense of purpose. His voice was steady, but not expectant. Richard stood in the kitchen, listening. He had seen this too, the way Tommy worked around silence rather than against it. The way he offered companionship rather than demanded it. It made his chest tighten. By afternoon, the boy's frustration finally surfaced. He won't eat, he won't drink. Tommy sat at the kitchen table, his hands clenched around his juice glass. "I don't know what to do." Richard set down his newspaper. "Then we call someone who does." Dr. Maria Lawson arrived that evening, her vet bag slung over her shoulder. She was a woman who had seen more than her fair share of neglected animals. Some physically broken, some simply lost inside themselves. She took one look at Gus and sighed. "This one's been through hell," she murmured, crouching down. "How long since you brought him home?" 2 days, Tommy answered. Dr. Lawson nodded, reaching for her stethoscope. "Well, let's see what we're dealing with." Gus barely acknowledged her touch. He did not flinch when she examined his ribs, nor when she pressed gently against an old wound near his shoulder. When she checked his teeth, she noted how worn they were, as if he had spent months gnawing on something other than food. She sat back on her heels, rubbing her hands together. "He's malnourished, but not starving. His body is healing, but his mind..." She glanced at Tommy. "That's going to take longer." Tommy swallowed. "Is he scared?" Dr. Lawson's gaze softened. "Yes," she said simply, "and tired." The boy hesitated, then asked the question that had been pressing against him since the moment they brought Gus home. Did someone hurt him? There was a pause. Then, with the weight of someone who had seen too much, she said, "I think so." Richard watched Tommy's face carefully. He saw the way his grandson absorbed that answer, the way his small fingers curled into his sleeves. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Tommy nodded. "Okay," he said. "I'll just have to show him he's safe now." That night, Richard sat alone in his study, staring at the low flames in the fireplace. He thought about the boy who sat beside a dog that wouldn't look at him. He thought about the way Tommy held onto things that had been abandoned, how he poured love into spaces that refused to hold it. And he thought about Caleb, about the way his son had written letters home, telling stories of men who carried more weight than their shoulders should bear, about the way he had always fought for those who had no fight left in them. Richard swallowed, pressing his fingers against his temple. Some things, it seemed, ran in the blood. The morning unfolded slowly, sunlight filtering through the windows in soft golden streaks, stretching across the hardwood floors of the estate. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves through the slightly opened kitchen door. Outside, a gardener raked absent-mindedly, the rhythmic rustle of leaves merging with the occasional distant bark from neighborhood dogs, sounds that Gus did not react to. Tommy sat cross-legged on the floor, his back leaning against the kitchen island. A small piece of chicken rested a few feet away from Gus, an offering left without expectation. The boy made no sudden moves, no coaxing gestures. He had learned that patience was the only language Gus seemed to understand. Richard observed from his chair at the dining table, one hand wrapped around his coffee mug. He had never considered himself a man of sentiment, but watching his grandson's quiet persistence stirred something in him. The boy wasn't trying to fix Gus. He was simply trying to be there. For days, it had been this way. Gus still refused the bed Tommy had prepared, still lay stiffly by the door, as though awaiting a command that never came. He ate little, drank even less. But he stayed. That, in itself, felt like progress. Richard sighed and stood, setting his coffee down with a soft clink. He ruffled Tommy's hair in passing, then stepped outside, leaving the boy and the dog alone in their unspoken conversation. Evenings in the Collins estate carried a particular kind of quiet, the kind that settled deep, unshaken by the presence of wealth or the hum of a distant television. It was the quiet of a place too big for the people left in it. Richard found Tommy exactly where he had left him that morning, still sitting near Gus, this time with a book open in his lap. The boy had dozed off, his head lolled slightly to the side, the gentle rise and fall of his chest, the only indication of sleep. The book, a worn copy of The Call of the Wild, lay across his knees, its pages still open to where he had been reading. Richard's gaze flickered to Gus. The dog was awake, but he hadn't moved away. That was new. He crouched down beside Tommy and gently closed the book, careful not to wake him. Gus's eyes shifted ever so slightly in his direction, unreadable but aware. Richard exhaled. "You're not going anywhere, are you?" His voice was low, almost to himself. Gus didn't move. A quiet, reluctant respect settled in Richard's chest. The dog had been given every reason to run, from whatever past he had come from this house, from this boy who refused to give up on him. And yet, he stayed. Richard didn't know if that was a good thing or a sad one. With a shake of his head, he carefully lifted Tommy into his arms, carrying him to bed. The boy murmured something in his sleep, but didn't wake. Gus's gaze followed them until they were gone. The breakthrough came in the smallest of ways. A few mornings later, Tommy walked into the kitchen and stopped. The piece of chicken he had left the night before. It was gone. His heart jumped. He turned to look at Gus, who lay in the same spot, seemingly unchanged, but something felt different. The air between them had shifted, just a little. Tommy knelt down carefully. "Did you eat it?" His voice was barely above a whisper, as if afraid to startle the moment away. Gus didn't respond, but for the first time, his ears twitched at the sound of Tommy's voice. It was nothing. A small flicker, a breath of movement. But to Tommy, it was everything. He grinned, barely containing his excitement, and ran out of the room. "Grandpa, he ate it." Richard, in the middle of reading his newspaper, looked up as Tommy practically skidded into the room. "Gus ate the chicken," the boy repeated breathlessly. "And—" He hesitated, struggling to find words for something so small, yet monumental. "And he listened." Richard studied his grandson for a long moment, taking in the quiet triumph in his eyes. Then, with a slow nod, he folded the newspaper and stood. "Come on, kid," he said. "Let's go see about that dog." That night, Tommy sat beside Gus again. This time, he didn't bring food, didn't bring a book. He just sat. And Gus, for the first time, turned his head slightly, as if acknowledging that the boy was there. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over the estate, its rays filtering through the high windows of the study, painting long shadows across the dark oak floors. The faint scent of Richard's old cigars lingered in the room, mixing with the worn leather of books that lined the walls. A soft ticking from the grandfather clock punctuated the silence, marking time in a house that, for years now, had felt suspended, stagnant in a way Richard could never quite put into words. Tommy sat cross-legged on the floor, a thick family album spread across his lap. The pages were old, but well kept, filled with snapshots of Christmas mornings, summer vacations, and birthdays once celebrated with laughter that had since faded into memory. Gus lay nearby, still choosing the cold tile of the foyer over the warmth of the plush dog bed Tommy had left untouched. The boy flipped through the pages slowly, his fingers tracing over the faces he knew and loved. His mother, his father, his grandfather, standing in the background of nearly every picture, his arms folded, a firm but present figure in their lives. "You probably don't care about this," Tommy murmured, casting a glance at Gus. The dog didn't react, only blinking lazily as if indifferent to the sound of the boy's voice. Tommy sighed but kept going. "This is my mom," he continued, tilting the album so Gus could see, even if the gesture felt silly. "She's good at baking. She used to make these cookies with so much cinnamon that I thought my tongue would fall off." He gave a small, breathy laugh. Dad would eat them anyway, and pretend they were great. His hand moved to the next page. More memories, more warmth frozen in time. And then Caleb. Tommy paused. The picture was one of his favorites, even if it hurt to look at. His father stood in his uniform, smiling broadly, his cap tilted slightly, as though he had pushed it back right before the picture was taken. His arm was draped over a fellow soldier, both of them caught mid-laughter, relaxed in a way that made it hard to believe this was taken during wartime. "This is my dad," Tommy said, his voice softer now, filled with something deeper than nostalgia. "His name was Caleb. He was in the army. Everyone says he was a good man." Something changed then. Gus, who had been lying still, shifted. It was slight, but Tommy saw it. The way the dog's ears twitched, the way his body tensed, as if something long buried had been stirred awake. The boy barely breathed as Gus inched forward, his gaze locked onto the photograph. The movement was slow, hesitant, like a man reaching out to touch a ghost. Then, ever so gently, Gus lowered his nose to the picture, breathing in deeply, his nostrils flaring. Tommy didn't move. The dog exhaled, a sound so quiet yet so heavy that it sent a shiver down Tommy's spine. Then, in a motion so deliberate it felt almost sacred, Gus placed a single paw over the photograph, holding it there, his claws barely grazing the surface. Tommy swallowed, his heart hammering in his chest. "Do you—" He hesitated. The question felt too big, too impossible. "Did you know him?" Gus didn't answer, of course, but something in his posture, in the way he refused to let go of that picture, made the room feel smaller, tighter, like the weight of an old truth had finally pressed in. Tommy's hands tightened around the edges of the album. For weeks, Gus had been indifferent to everything: food, affection, safety. But not this. Not Caleb. The realization made Tommy's throat tighten. He didn't know what it meant, not yet, but the pieces of something important, were beginning to form. That night, Richard found Gus curled around the photograph. The dog had dragged it from the album when Tommy wasn't looking, and now it rested between his paws, the edges bent slightly from where he had held it too tightly. The sight stopped Richard in his tracks. He had spent a lifetime keeping his emotions measured, calculated even. But this was not coincidence. He moved slowly, stepping closer without making a sound. The fire in the study had dimmed, casting long, flickering shadows that danced across Gus's form. Richard crouched. The dog's breathing was steady but deep, almost strained. Not asleep, not awake. Somewhere in between. His hand hovered just above Gus's head. He hesitated. Then, in a rare, quiet moment of softness, he whispered, "Who were you to my son?" Gus didn't move, but in the silence that followed, Richard felt the weight of a story that had yet to be told. Richard stood at the study window, phone in hand, staring out at the vast stretch of trees beyond the estate. The morning mist clung stubbornly to the ground, curling around the roots of the old oaks like a ghost unwilling to leave. He took a slow breath and dialed. The line rang twice before a voice answered. "Mr. Collins?" Martin's voice was rough, marked by the weight of years and service. "Didn't think I'd be hearing from you." Richard hesitated, then spoke. "I need you to come by." There was a pause, then the faint rustling of movement on the other end. "Is this about Caleb?" "Yes," Richard said, his gaze flickering toward the study's open door, where just beyond, Gus lay curled on the floor, still clutching the photograph as if it held something vital and something else. Martin didn't ask for details. "I'll be there by noon." Tommy sat on the back porch, absently tossing a tennis ball between his hands. Gus lay at his feet, unmoving, but something in his posture had changed. He wasn't pressed against the door anymore. He wasn't recoiling when Tommy sat close. Still, his eyes remained distant, lost somewhere Tommy couldn't follow. The sound of an approaching car broke the quiet. Tommy turned to see an old Jeep roll up the driveway, the tires crunching over the gravel. A man stepped out, a soldier, even without the uniform. His posture, the way he carried himself, and the sharp, assessing eyes. It was all there. Martin was taller than Tommy had expected, his frame lean but solid. His hair had thinned at the temples, streaked with grey, but his presence was anything but diminished. He took in the house, the porch, and then, finally, the boy. "You must be Tommy. I'm Martin, Caleb's old teammate. I'm here on Mr. Collins's message," he said. The boy nodded. Martin's gaze drifted downward, landing on Gus. His brow furrowed. Richard appeared behind them, stepping onto the porch with his usual measured pace. He exchanged a glance with Martin, one of those looks filled with history, too deep for words. Then, without preamble, Martin crouched. Gus tensed, his muscles going rigid, but he didn't move. Martin studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Fred 209. The reaction was immediate. Gus stiffened, his ears shooting up. His head snapped toward Martin, eyes wide, not in fear, but in recognition. His breath hitched, his body momentarily frozen between past and present. Then, in the span of a heartbeat, he moved. With a force Tommy hadn't seen before, Gus surged forward, his tail wagging. Not just a slow, reluctant motion, but an eager, desperate rhythm. A sound, half whimper, half growl, escaped him as he pressed against Martin's legs, his nose frantically searching for a scent long lost. Martin didn't flinch. His hand found Gus's head, pressing firmly against it. "Damn," he muttered under his breath, his voice thick with something unreadable. "I'll be damned." Tommy stared, barely breathing. Richard folded his arms, his gaze never leaving the scene. "So it's him," he said quietly. Martin nodded. He took a steadying breath before looking at Tommy. "This isn't just some stray kid." His voice softened, but there was steel beneath it. "This is Fred 209, your father's dog." The words felt heavy, too big to fit in the air between them. Tommy swallowed hard. "You mean he was with my dad? Like, really with him?" Martin exhaled. "Yeah, kid, more than that. He saved your dad's life more times than I can count." Silence settled, thick and stretching. Tommy's fingers clenched around the tennis ball, still in his hands. "Tell me," he said. Martin hesitated for only a moment before nodding. He sat down on the porch steps, scratching Gus's ears with familiarity, as though some part of him had never expected to see the dog again. And yet, here they were. "He was assigned to Caleb in Afghanistan," Martin began, his voice steady, but not unaffected. "They were paired for patrols, mostly, tracking threats, scouting ahead. But Fred—" He shook his head with a small, near smile. "He wasn't just a soldier's dog. He was Caleb's shadow. That dog followed him everywhere, no leash, no commands needed. They understood each other. Caleb would glance, and Fred would know what to do." Tommy's throat felt tight. "There was this one mission." Martin's gaze turned distant, like he was seeing something far away. "We were pinned down, outside a village, caught in the open. Caleb had taken position behind a broken-down truck, but he was exposed. We couldn't get to him." Martin's fingers stilled against Gus's fur. "Fred didn't wait for an order. He just ran, straight through gunfire, through chaos. He got to Caleb, dragged him down, shielded him with his own damn body. His jaw tightened. Took a bullet for him too, right in the shoulder. Tommy inhaled sharply. His eyes flickered to Gus, Fred, who lay there, silent, but listening. But he lived, Martin finished, glancing at Tommy, because Caleb wouldn't let him go. We got him patched up, and he stayed right where he belonged, beside your dad. A long, heavy pause. Tommy's hands trembled as he reached out, placing them gently on Gus's back. The dog didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He simply lay there, the same way he had once lain beside Caleb. Why wasn't he with him at the end? Tommy's voice cracked slightly. Martin sighed. Regulations. When Caleb was transferred, Fred got reassigned. But I know. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. I know Caleb never stopped thinking about him. Richard, quiet until now, finally spoke. How did he end up like this? Martin shook his head. After Caleb, after he was gone, it was almost depressed, inactive, not barking, not eating as if it was the one who had passed away. Then, Fred was retired early, no reassignment. He was supposed to be placed in a veterans program, but somehow, he slipped through the cracks. His jaw clenched. Damned system. A long silence stretched between them. Then Tommy spoke, his voice small but firm. Well, he said, his fingers still pressed into Gus's fur. He's home now. Gus let out a breath, long, slow, as if something deep within him had finally let go. Do you like to have a pet in your house? If so, leave a comment. Dog. Otherwise write hot dog. The sky had darkened into a deep shade of blue by the time Martin stood at the front steps of the Collins estate. The porch light flickered softly, casting long shadows over the stone walkway. Gus, Fred 209, sat beside Tommy, no longer pressed against the door, as if waiting for an escape. Instead, he was still, watching. Martin adjusted his jacket, his expression thoughtful. His gaze shifted between Richard and Tommy before settling on the dog. You take care of him, he said, his voice quiet but firm. This is home now, Fred. You're exactly where you're supposed to be. One more time, Fred lifted his head at the sound of his name. It wasn't the sharp reaction he had given earlier, but it was there, a flicker of acknowledgement. Martin exhaled, giving the dog one last pat before turning to Richard. He's got a long road ahead, he said, but I think you already know that. Richard nodded. We'll take care of him. Martin's eyes softened. And he'll take care of you, he said simply, before giving Tommy a brief nod and stepping down into the night. Fred 209 was home now. Tommy tried to let that thought settle, but as the days passed, he realized that home didn't mean whole. The night had settled thick and heavy over the estate, wrapping the house in a quiet that felt deeper than usual. The old grandfather clock in the hallway marked the passing minutes, each tick stretching into something weighty, something unspoken. The conversation from earlier still lingered in the air, its echoes filling the spaces between them. Tommy sat on the living room rug, his legs tucked under him, absently running his fingers over Gus's fur. Or Fred 209. The name still felt foreign on his tongue, as though it belonged to someone else, someone the dog used to be. Richard sat nearby, his whiskey glass resting untouched on the side table. Martin had left hours ago, but his words remained. Retired early, slipped through the cracks, lost. The idea of his son's dog being discarded, abandoned in some shelter after a lifetime of service, it gnawed at him. Tommy spoke without looking up. What happens to a soldier when he doesn't have a mission anymore? Richard exhaled slowly. It's different for everyone. But for Fred, The boy's voice was quiet, careful. Richard studied the dog. Gus, Fred, lay still, his head resting between his paws, his body unmoving but not asleep. He had recognized Martin, responded to his name, even wagged his tail. But since Martin left, he had retreated again, slipping back into that detached state. "He doesn't know what to do with himself," Richard murmured. Tommy was silent for a long moment, his fingers idly tracing over the scars hidden beneath Fred's fur. "He was my dad's, but then my dad was gone." He swallowed. "Then he was supposed to go somewhere safe. But he didn't. And now he's here." Richard watched his grandson carefully. "Does that mean he's supposed to be here?" Tommy asked. Richard hesitated. He didn't believe in fate. He never had. But something about this, something about the way this dog had found its way back to them after all this time. "I think that's up to him," Richard finally said. Tommy's shoulders sagged slightly, disappointment flickering across his face. "But what if he never wants to be here?" Richard leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "Healing doesn't happen in a day, son." His voice was firm, steady. "You don't rush something that's been broken. You just give it time to put itself back together." Tommy no answer, just nod slightly. The dog had changed. Or maybe he had never really left the battlefield. He ate, but only when Tommy wasn't looking. He slept, but only in the hallway, never in the warmth of the bed Tommy had prepared. He flinched at sudden noises, his head snapping toward distant sounds, as if expecting an unseen threat. His body was here, but his mind was somewhere else. And worse, he wouldn't play. Tommy had tried everything. He rolled a ball across the floor. Nothing. He dangled an old rope toy, the kind any other dog would have instinctively grabbed. Fred barely glanced at it. He even set down a stick outside, waiting, hoping for the flicker of an old instinct. But there was no joy in him, and Tommy was beginning to feel the weight of that loss. One afternoon, after yet another failed attempt, Tommy sat down on the cold marble floor beside Fred, frustration creeping into his voice. "You don't have to be like this forever, you know." Fred didn't move. Tommy exhaled sharply, tilting his head back against the wooden paneling. He wanted to understand, needed to. For weeks, he had been patient. He had sat with Fred, fed him, read to him, but the dog remained a ghost of himself, locked in a past that refused to let go. And deep down, Tommy felt it. A hollow ache that had nothing to do with Fred at all. It was the same ache that had lived inside him since the day his mother told him Caleb wasn't coming home. The same hollow silence that filled the space where his father's voice used to be. Tommy clenched his fists, staring down at the tiles. It wasn't fair. It wasn't fair that Fred had found his way back, but his dad never would. It wasn't fair that everyone kept telling him to be patient when all he wanted was to hear his father's voice again, to feel his presence in something more than just photographs and folded uniforms. And it wasn't fair that Fred, who had been given a second chance, wouldn't take it. A lump rose in Tommy's throat. He swallowed hard, staring at the floor. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I'm Caleb's son." Fred's ears twitched. Tommy's fingers curled around the hem of his sleeve. "I need you too." The dog didn't move. But for the first time, Tommy thought he heard something. A long, slow exhale, as if Fred had been holding his breath for too long. The boy stayed there, kneeling beside him, his hand resting lightly on the dog's back. He didn't know what he expected. Maybe nothing. But as the silence stretched between them, Tommy let himself hope that maybe, just maybe, Fred had heard him. The morning air was crisp, edged with the first chill of autumn. Sunlight filtered through the thinning canopy of trees surrounding the Collins estate, dappling the ground with golden light. Leaves crunched softly under Tommy's sneakers as he stepped onto the path leading away from the house, a leash slack in his hands. Fred walked beside him, not reluctantly, not hesitantly. He simply walked. It had taken weeks to reach this point, weeks of patient gestures, of whispered reassurances, of sitting together in silence. Tommy had stopped expecting too much and had learned to be content with the smallest of victories. But this was something bigger. Fred wasn't following out of duty or habit. He was choosing to walk beside him. Tommy felt his chest swell with quiet pride. He glanced down, watching the way Fred's ears twitched at every distant sound, his posture still alert, but no longer rigid, with tension. He wasn't a soldier on edge anymore, at least, not completely. They hadn't ventured far beyond the estate before, but today, Tommy felt something shift. "Let's go a little further," he murmured, more to himself than Fred. The dog didn't protest. They continued down the path, past the stone wall that marked the edge of the property, past the open fields that stretched toward the outskirts of town. Tommy had always liked walking here. It made him feel smaller, but in a way that was comforting, like the world was big enough to carry things for him when he couldn't. But that peace didn't last long. A group of boys stood at the bend in the path, clustered together near a fallen tree. Tommy recognized them immediately. They were older, maybe 13, maybe 14, the kind of kids who always had too much confidence, too little kindness. He'd seen them before, outside the convenience store, at the park, their laughter sharp-edged, their words meant to sting. One of them spotted him first. "Well, look who it is." Tommy felt his stomach tighten. Another boy snickered. "Hey, rich boy. Decided to take a walk on the poor side of town." Tommy clenched his fists. He hated that nickname. He hated how they said it like it was an insult, as if having money made him something less, something weak. He wasn't weak, but he'd learned that fighting back only made it worse. He kept walking, staring straight ahead, pretending not to hear. But they weren't going to let him go that easily. "Are you going to run home to your big fancy house?" one of them taunted, stepping closer. "Or maybe have your butler fight for you?" Laughter followed. Tommy forced himself to stay calm. He wasn't going to let them get to him. He wasn't. Then, one of them took another step forward, and Fred moved. It happened so fast, so instinctively, that Tommy barely had time to process it. One moment, Fred was at his side, quiet and composed. The next, he was in front of him, ears pinned back, chest low, teeth bared. And then he barked. It wasn't just a bark, it was a command, a warning, a sound that cut through the morning air like a gunshot. The boys flinched. One of them actually stumbled backward. "What the hell?" Fred didn't lunge, he didn't snap, but he stood his ground, and for the first time, Tommy wasn't scared. He looked at the boys, at their wide eyes, at the way their confidence faltered in the face of something bigger, something stronger. "You were saying?" Tommy's voice was steady, calmer than he felt. The tallest boy swallowed. "Whatever, man. We were just messing around." But they were already stepping back. One of them muttered something under his breath before they turned and disappeared down the trail. Silence settled around them. Fred remained in place, muscles still coiled, breath steady. His eyes followed the boys until they were gone, his stance unwavering. Tommy stared at him. Then, a laugh bubbled out of him, sudden and unexpected. "You—" Tommy shook his head, grinning. "You just scared the hell out of them. You're protecting me now, huh?" Fred turned his head slightly, looking at Tommy now, his expression unreadable. Tommy felt a warmth spread through his chest. It wasn't just protection, it was loyalty. His father had once had that. Now he did too. Tommy reached out, his fingers brushing over Fred's fur. "You're protecting me now," he murmured, "just like you did for my dad." And for the first time, Fred didn't pull away. The sky hung low with heavy grey clouds, the kind that threatened rain, but never quite followed through. A cold breeze whispered through the bare trees, shaking loose the last of their brittle leaves. The world felt still, expectant. Richard drove without speaking, his hands steady on the wheel. The long road leading to the cemetery was familiar, but it never got easier. The silence in the car stretched, thick and weighted. Tommy sat in the back seat, the old family photograph clutched tightly in his hands. The edges were worn from too much handling, from too many nights spent staring at it, as if the image itself could bring his father back. Beside him, Fred, or maybe it was still Gus in his mind, lay with his head resting on Tommy's lap. His body was warm, steady, his breathing slow but alert. He wasn't asleep. He was waiting. As the cemetery gates loomed ahead, Richard finally spoke. "You sure you want to do this?" Tommy swallowed. "Yeah." A pause. Then Richard gave a single nod and pulled into the gravel path. The walk was slow. The cemetery was quiet, but not the peaceful kind, more like the world was holding its breath. Richard led the way, but Tommy and Fred moved as one, their steps unhurried, their silence speaking louder than words. As they neared Caleb's grave, something shifted. Fred's body stiffened, not in fear, not in hesitation, something deeper. His ears flicked back, his nose twitched, his pace faltered just slightly. Then he inhaled. It was deep and deliberate, as if trying to find something long lost in the air. Tommy felt it before he understood it. The way Fred suddenly became aware of the space, the way his body trembled, not with cold, but recognition. And then he stopped. Just feet away from the tombstone, Fred planted himself in place. He stood still, unmoving, his eyes locked on the name carved into stone. Tommy's chest tightened. He had never seen Fred like this before. He had seen him afraid, seen him lost. But this was something else. Slowly, Fred took a step forward, then another. He moved with purpose, as if pulled by something only he could feel. When he reached the grave, he sat, and he didn't look away. Richard watched from a few steps behind. His face, usually unreadable, held something softer now, something resigned. Tommy knelt beside Fred, his fingers brushing against the dog's back, grounding himself. Fred let out a long, slow exhale. His body sagged slightly, as if the weight he had been carrying for so long had suddenly become unbearable. Then, a single tear slipped down his dark fur. Tommy swallowed hard. He had never seen a dog cry before, not really. But then again, Fred wasn't just any dog. The lump in Tommy's throat grew tighter. He wanted to say something, but everything felt too small. So he did the only thing he could. He stayed. For a long time, the three of them just existed in that space, surrounded by the hush of the cemetery, the distant rustling of trees. Finally, Tommy found his voice. "He's at peace, Fred," he whispered, "and you don't have to be alone anymore." Fred didn't move right away. Then, slowly, he lowered his head and rested it against the stone. A final goodbye. A soldier standing guard, one last time. The house felt different when they returned, not in a loud or obvious way, no grand shift, no sudden transformation. But something had changed. The silence wasn't as heavy. Tommy noticed it first. Fred no longer hesitated at the front door. He walked inside without stopping, without looking over his shoulder, as if expecting to be sent away. He still moved carefully, as if the walls around him were unfamiliar terrain, but he moved. Richard noticed it too. The dog that once pressed himself against the cold tile now followed Tommy from room to room. Not always close, but never too far. When Tommy sat at the kitchen table doing homework, Fred lay at his feet. When Tommy wandered outside, Fred followed, his gaze scanning the yard as if memorizing it. And then there was the eating. Tommy caught it one night. Fred eating while he was still in the room. It wasn't much. A few cautious bites, slow and deliberate. But he didn't wait for the house to go quiet. He didn't wait for Tommy to leave. Tommy watched from the hallway, heart swelling with something close to relief. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Days passed and Fred's walls continued to lower brick by brick. Tommy could feel it in the way Fred watched him now, not with wary distance, but with something softer, something steadier. One afternoon, as the autumn breeze carried the scent of damp leaves through the open windows, Tommy sat cross-legged on the living room floor. He reached for Fred's old rope toy, hesitant, unsure if it was too soon. He held it up, dangling it slightly. "What do you think?" Fred stared at it. Tommy bit his lip, expecting the same indifference as before. Then, a shift. Fred's ears twitched. His body tensed, not in fear, but in recognition. His eyes tracked the movement of the rope, following the sway of it. Tommy didn't breathe. And then, Fred lifted his paw, ever so slightly. It was small. So small that anyone else might have missed it. But Tommy saw. He felt his throat tighten, the first flicker of something lost coming back to life. He set the rope down and nodded. "We'll try again tomorrow." Fred blinked, then rested his head on his paws. But his tail, just barely, moved. Richard sat on the porch that evening, watching as Tommy and Fred wandered into the backyard. He didn't call out to them, didn't interrupt, just watched. The boy stood in the middle of the yard, a tennis ball in hand. Fred sat a few feet away, ears perked, watching. Richard frowned slightly. Tommy had tried this before. Fred had never chased after the ball, not once, but this time, something was different. Tommy lifted the ball. "Okay, Fred," he said, his voice light, almost teasing. "Let's see what you've got." He threw it. It soared through the air, bouncing once against the grass. And Fred hesitated. His muscles twitched. His eyes tracked the ball, his body tensing, like it remembered something. But he didn't move. Tommy's shoulders dropped slightly. But then, Fred bolted. It was clumsy at first. His paws dug into the ground awkwardly, as if the motion was unfamiliar. But he ran. He chased the ball down, catching it mid-air before it hit the ground again. Tommy's breath caught. Fred landed, paws skidding slightly in the grass. Then, slowly, he turned back. For a long moment, he just stood there, holding the ball. And then, he ran back to Tommy. The boy laughed, pure and bright, as he crouched down to take the ball from Fred's mouth. Richard exhaled, something deep in his chest loosening. The spark. It was there, in both of them. And this time, it wasn't fading. A week later, the estate welcomed visitors. Richard had an important meeting, one he didn't particularly care for, but couldn't avoid. His business partner, James Whitmore, arrived in the afternoon, bringing along his 6-year-old daughter, Mary. Mary was a bright-eyed, chatty girl with loose pigtails and an endless stream of energy. She clung to her father's hand at first, hesitant in the unfamiliar house, but as soon as she spotted Tommy, she beamed. "Hi, I'm Mary," she announced, skipping forward. "Who are you?" "Tommy," he answered, startled by her enthusiasm. Mary's gaze flickered downward. "And who's that?" Fred, who had been sitting at Tommy's feet, lifted his head. He was used to strangers now, used to the presence of others in the house. But small children, that was new. "This is Fred," Tommy said. Mary crouched down, staring at the dog with wide, curious eyes. "He's big." Tommy smirked. "Yeah." She tilted her head. "Can I pet him?" Tommy hesitated. He looked down at Fred, watching for any signs of unease. But the dog wasn't tense. He simply looked at Mary, waiting. Tommy nodded. "Yeah, just be gentle." Mary reached out, her tiny fingers brushing over Fred's fur. The dog remained still, his gaze locked onto her, reading her in the way only dogs could. Then, slowly, his tail wagged. Just once, just barely. Mary giggled. Tommy felt something loosen in his chest. "You want to play outside?" he asked. "Yes," Mary cheered, already grabbing his hand. The backyard was wide, open, safe. The kids ran across the grass, laughing, the sound of childhood filling the air. Fred trotted beside them, watching, always watching. Tommy wasn't sure what kind of game they were playing. It was mostly just running, dodging, laughing. Mary wasn't a child who played by rules. She invented them as she went. At one point, Tommy grabbed a stick, holding it out in front of him. "You think you can catch me?" Mary shrieked in delight. "Try me!" They ran, weaving between trees, their feet kicking up dirt. Fred followed, his instincts pulling him toward them, not to chase, but to guard. It happened fast, too fast. Mary's foot caught on a root, her body tipping forward. Tommy, running just ahead of her, turned just in time to see her fall toward the edge of the pond. Fred moved before Tommy could. He lunged forward, catching Mary's jacket in his jaws, pulling her back with a force that sent himself tumbling forward instead. His body hit the water. Tommy barely had time to react before he was moving, dropping to his knees at the edge. "Fred!" The dog surfaced almost instantly, paddling toward the shore, his dark fur slicked against his body. He pulled himself up, shaking the water from his coat. Mary, still sitting on the grass where she had been pulled, stared in wide-eyed shock. Then, a slow smile spread across her face. That was so cool. Tommy exhaled, relief rushing through him. He turned to Fred, who stood there, dripping wet, staring at him as if waiting for approval. Tommy grinned. "You saved her." Fred huffed, shaking himself again, sending water flying everywhere. Mary squealed with laughter. From the porch, Richard had seen everything. He leaned against the railing, shaking his head with a small chuckle. Fred looked up at him. Richard nodded. "Good job, soldier." Fred wagged his tail, and for the first time in a long time, he looked happy. The morning air was crisp, laced with the scent of damp grass and earth. The sky stretched endlessly above, tinged with the soft colors of dawn. Tommy tightened his shoelaces, glancing down at Fred, who sat attentively by his side. It had become a routine now, their routine. Every morning, they ran. Not just a casual jog, but structured runs, short sprints, long-distance strides, weaving through the trees on the outer edges of the estate. Tommy had started slow, unsure if Fred would follow, unsure if the old soldier in him still remembered the thrill of movement, the pull of momentum. But Fred never hesitated. Each day his speed increased, his steps grew lighter, his posture changed. Tommy grinned as he broke into a sprint across the open yard. "Come on, Fred." The Rottweiler hesitated for only a second before bolting after him, his paws digging into the damp ground. His movements were sleek, precise, instincts honed from years of training finally stirring awake. It wasn't just running anymore. It was reclaiming. Richard watched from the porch, his usual cup of coffee cooling in his hands. He had noticed the change. Fred was no longer the ghostly presence lingering in doorways, no longer the silent shadow lurking on the edges of their home. He moved differently now, his steps more sure, his body no longer burdened by the weight of a past he couldn't escape. But more than that, Richard saw it in Tommy. His grandson stood taller. His voice carried more certainty. Fred had found something again, and so had Tommy. One afternoon, Richard called Tommy into his study. The boy entered, Fred padding beside him, his gaze flickering between them, as if sensing something important was about to be said. Richard leaned back in his chair, considering his words. "You've done a good job with him," he said finally, nodding toward Fred. "He's not the same dog we brought home." Tommy placed a hand on Fred's back, a quiet gesture of agreement. Richard studied them for a moment before continuing. "There's a place I want to take you both, a facility not far from here, a program that helps retired military dogs adjust to civilian life. Some of them still need homes, but most, they just need a purpose again." Tommy frowned slightly, like a second chance. Richard nodded. Something like that. The idea settled into Tommy's chest, heavy but right. Fred had changed. He had healed, but maybe he still had more to give. The facility was quieter than Tommy expected. No harsh barks, no chaotic sounds, just the rhythmic padding of paws, the occasional command being issued by trainers. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and something more sterile, but it didn't feel cold. It felt like discipline, like order. Fred stood at Tommy's side, his ears twitching, his body alert but not tense. He wasn't afraid. A trainer approached, shaking Richard's hand before turning to Tommy. "So this is the famous Fred 209, he mused, crouching slightly to meet the dog's gaze. Fred didn't shy away. Tommy straightened a little, pride swelling in his chest. The trainer smiled. "Would you like to introduce him to one of our dogs?" Tommy hesitated, glancing at Fred. He had come so far, but this was new. He took a breath and nodded. "Yeah, let's try." They led Fred into a fenced training area, where another Rottweiler stood near the far end. The dog was broad, well-muscled, his coat slightly graying around the muzzle. His ears flicked as Fred entered, but he didn't move. Fred stopped. For a long moment, neither dog did anything. They simply stared at each other, reading, measuring. Then, recognition. Fred stepped forward, his tail lifting slightly, his posture shifting into something calm, familiar. The other dog mirrored him. There was no growling, no territorial posturing, just quiet understanding. Richard, watching from the side, nodded approvingly. He remembers what it's like to be among his own. Tommy felt something warm bloom in his chest. Fred had found his place in their home. But maybe, just maybe, he had more to give to the world too. The sky stretched vast and clear above them, painted in hues of blue and gold as the late afternoon sun hung lazily over the park. The air carried the scent of fresh grass and warm earth, mingled with the distant laughter of children and the rhythmic creak of swings swaying in the breeze. Tommy jogged ahead, his sneakers kicking up small tufts of dust along the winding path. Fred trotted beside him, his dark coat gleaming under the sunlight, his posture loose and relaxed. His ears flicked at passing sounds, birds chattering, bicycles whirring by, a frisbee landing somewhere in the distance. But there was no tension, no hesitation. He was simply living. Richard followed behind at a slower pace, his cane tapping lightly against the pavement with each step. He had insisted he didn't need it today, but Tommy had given him that look, and that was enough for Richard to sigh and bring it along. Truth be told, Richard didn't mind. Not today. Not as he watched his grandson run ahead freely, laughter bubbling from his throat, no longer weighed down by invisible grief. Not as he watched Fred, no longer a ghost of himself, keeping up, his tail wagging, his eyes alive with purpose. It was a sight Richard hadn't dared to imagine when they first brought Fred home. But here they were. Tommy skidded to a stop near an open stretch of grass and turned, grinning as he reached into his pocket. He held up a tennis ball, his eyes bright with anticipation. "Ready?" he asked. Fred stood still, watching him. For a moment, Richard wondered if the hesitation would return, if that instinct would falter. But then, Fred lowered his stance, his weight shifting slightly forward. He was ready. Tommy threw the ball. Fred was already moving, his muscles coiled, then exploded as he sprinted across the grass, his paws barely touching the ground. His eyes locked on the ball, tracking it mid-air, his instincts, honed from years of training, snapping into place. He leaped, caught it, landed smoothly. Tommy whooped, pumping his fists in the air. "Yes! Good boy, Fred!" Fred trotted back, head high, tail wagging proudly as he dropped the ball at Tommy's feet. Tommy laughed, reaching down to ruffle his fur. "That was amazing. You're amazing." Fred let out a soft huff, nudging Tommy's arm as if urging him to throw it again. Richard sat on a bench nearby, taking it all in. He had spent a lifetime building, securing, protecting. His wealth had given him power, control, certainty. But this, watching his grandson play, watching a broken dog mend itself in ways no human ever could. This was something he had never been able to buy, and he wouldn't trade it for anything. They stayed at the park longer than they had planned. Tommy played fetch with Fred until their legs were sore, until the sun began to dip lower behind the trees. Richard eventually had to call them in, muttering about getting home before dinner turned cold. Tommy plopped down on the grass beside the bench, breathless but grinning. Fred followed, lowering himself beside him, not out of exhaustion, just contentment. For the first time, he didn't need to be on guard. He stretched out, resting his head against Tommy's knee, his body completely at ease. Tommy let his fingers comb through Fred's fur, absent-mindedly, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. The sky had started to turn soft shades of orange and violet, painting everything in its glow. Richard leaned back against the bench, exhaling deeply. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "I think Caleb would have liked seeing this." Tommy's fingers stilled for a moment. Then he nodded. "He would have," Tommy said quietly. "I think he'd be happy knowing Fred is okay." Richard gave a small hum of agreement. "And knowing that you are, too." Tommy smiled at that, not the forced kind he used to wear after Caleb's death, a real one. He looked down at Fred, who blinked up at him, calm and steady. "We're okay, aren't we, boy?" Fred sighed, a deep, long breath, not of exhaustion, but of peace. Tommy chuckled, giving him one last pat. "Yeah, we're okay." The sun dipped lower, the world quieted, and in the golden light of the evening, a new chapter had begun. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.